On Memorial Day weekend, May 1996, California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, better known as Cal Poly, was buzzing with the energy of college students finishing their semester. Among them was a 19-year-old freshman named Kristin Smart. Kristin wasn't just any student. She was young, vibrant, and full of ambition. Friends described her as funny, confident, and always ready for adventure. She was 6 feet tall, athletic, and dreamed of a career in architecture or journalism. Kristin was the kind of person who stood out in a crowd not just because of her height, but because of the energy she carried with her. She had moved from her family's home in Stockton, California, to start a new life at Cal Poly. Her parents, Stan and Denise Smart, supported her dreams but also worried. Kristin was their eldest daughter, and college meant freedom, a freedom that came with risks. Kristin called home often, and her family thought she was adjusting well. But on the night of May 24th, 1996, everything changed. That Friday evening, Kristin decided to go out with friends. It was the start of a long holiday weekend, and there was excitement in the air. She attended a birthday party at a fraternity house a short distance from campus. The party was crowded, loud, and filled with music, alcohol, the typical energy of young college students blowing off steam. Witnesses later recalled that Kristin seemed to be drinking maybe more than she could handle. Some said she was stumbling, others said she seemed tired. At one point, she even lay down on the lawn outside the house, needing help to get up. Her friends left earlier in the night, and by the time the party wound down, Kristin was left without a ride back to her dorm. But she wasn't completely alone. 2 other students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, also began walking back to campus around 2 a.m. Along with them was another student to name that would become infamous in this story, Paul Flores. Paul Flores was known around campus, but not in the best way. He had a reputation for being awkward, persistent with women, and often made people uncomfortable. That night, he inserted himself into the group walking back. Cheryl and Tim both later said Kristin was unsteady on her feet, and Paul insisted on helping her. At some point, Tim broke off and went to his truck. Cheryl walked a little further, but when they reached her dorm, she left Kristin in Paul's company. Paul promised to walk Kristin the rest of the way to her dorm. It was the last time anyone ever saw Kristin Smart alive. The next morning, Kristin's friends noticed her absence. First, no one panicked. College students sometimes crashed at friends' places, skipped classes, or disappeared for a day or two. But soon concern began to grow. Kristin didn't return to her dorm. Her bed was untouched. Her belongings, including her purse and ID, were all still in her room. She missed phone calls from her parents, which was unusual. By Sunday, her friends were alarmed. They reported her missing to campus police. But here's where the case took a devastating turn. Cal Poly campus police didn't treat Kristin's disappearance as an emergency. They assumed she had gone on a trip for the long weekend, maybe to Santa Cruz or Los Angeles. After all, she was a college student. Young people sometimes did spontaneous things. This assumption cost valuable time. Kristin's parents, meanwhile, were frantic. They knew their daughter. She wasn't the type to vanish without a word. Something was wrong. By the time police finally began investigating, days had already passed, and the trail was already going cold. When investigators finally started digging into Kristin's last known moments, the focus quickly turned to Paul Flores, the last person seen with her. Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis both confirmed that Paul had been the one to walk Kristin to her dorm. Yet when police questioned him, his story was inconsistent. At first, Paul claimed he parted ways with Kristin near her dorm and went home. But his accounts shifted slightly each time. Police noticed scratches on his face and a black eye. When asked about them, Paul gave conflicting explanations. One time he said he got the black eye playing basketball. Another time he said he bumped his head while working on his truck. His story didn't add up. But without a body and without physical evidence, police were limited in what they could do. They searched Paul's dorm room, but it had already been cleaned for the summer. The sheets on his bed were missing. Cadaver dogs brought to the dorm alerted strongly to the scent of human decomposition in Paul's room. Still no body. Kristin's parents were devastated. They drove to San Luis Obispo, desperate for answers, but were met with frustration. The investigation moved slowly. Leads dried up quickly. Rumors spread across campus. Some students whispered that Kristin had overdosed at the party and that her death was covered up. Others believed Paul Flores knew far more than he admitted. But with no physical evidence tying him to Kristin's disappearance, the case stalled. As weeks turned into months, Kristin's face appeared on missing person posters across California. Her parents kept her story alive in the media, giving interviews, pleading for information, and holding out hope that someone would come forward. But the silence was deafening. By the end of 1996, Kristin Smart was still missing. Paul Flores remained the primary suspect, but investigators had little to hold him on, and her family was left with only questions. How could a young woman vanish on a college campus surrounded by people? Why weren't the police faster to act? And most chilling of all, was the man who knew the truth walking free among them. Kristin Smart's disappearance shook the Cal Poly community. But as weeks turned into months, the shock began to fade into frustration. The police had no body, no concrete evidence, and no answers. And in the silence of that uncertainty, suspicion kept pointing back to one name: Paul Flores. Paul had been the last person seen with Kristin. He was the one who insisted on walking her back to her dorm. And yet, his version of events never seemed to stay the same. His shifting stories, his unexplained injuries, and the eerie reaction of cadaver dogs to his dorm room, it all painted a disturbing picture. But without proof, law enforcement couldn't charge him. For Kristin's family, this wasn't just a mystery. It was a nightmare. Stan and Denise Smart, her parents, refused to give up. They pushed the police, hired private investigators, and kept Kristin's story in the media. They appeared on talk shows, distributed thousands of missing person flyers, and pleaded for information. Every day without answers deepened their grief. In 1997, a year after Kristin's disappearance, the Smart family made a painful but important decision. Kristin was officially declared legally dead. She was no longer considered just missing. She was presumed murdered. The case shifted from a search for a missing girl to a homicide investigation. Paul Flores by then was the prime suspect. But still there was no body, no crime scene, no weapon. Nothing prosecutors could take to court. The Flores family, Paul and his parents, Ruben and Susan, remained under scrutiny. Investigators believed Ruben might have helped Paul hide Kristin's body. But again, suspicion wasn't enough. Over the years, the Smart family's fight for justice grew into a symbol of perseverance. They established the Kristin Smart Foundation to support victims of crimes and to keep her memory alive. Her picture became a haunting reminder of unanswered questions. Meanwhile, the San Luis Obispo community remained divided. Some believed Paul Flores was guilty. Others thought maybe Kristin's death had been accidental, covered up by people at the party. Rumors swirled endlessly, but none led to closure. Then came another blow. The early investigation itself was criticized. Campus police had delayed treating Kristin's disappearance as suspicious. Evidence had been lost or mishandled. Paul's dorm room had been thoroughly cleaned before investigators searched it. By then, any traces of Kristin were gone. It was as if chance and negligence had conspired to bury the truth. As the 2000s began, hope for answers seemed to fade. But Paul Flores' name never disappeared. Women began coming forward, accusing Paul of harassment, assault, and predatory behavior. The stories painted him as dangerous a man who had been hiding in plain sight. Yet still, none of this directly tied him to Kristin. Investigators remained trapped. They had a suspect, but no physical evidence. Without evidence, the district attorney's office refused to prosecute. The Smart family lived in limbo. For them, every day was the same. They woke up wondering where Kristin was. They went to bed hoping tomorrow would bring news. Years slipped by, and the pain never lessened. But the case never died. Journalists, podcasters, and independent investigators began digging deeper. In the 2010s, renewed attention came from a new generation of true crime followers. Podcasts like Your Own Backyard by Chris Lambert reignited public interest, bringing fresh eyes and ears to the case. Chris Lambert, an ordinary music producer turned podcaster, dedicated himself to telling Kristin's story. His podcast uncovered details, questioned timelines, and shined a spotlight back on Paul Flores. His work stirred the community and pressured law enforcement to revisit the case. They did. By 2016, 20 years after Kristin's disappearance, technology had advanced. Ground-penetrating radar and advanced forensic methods offered new hope. Investigators searched areas around the Flores family's property. Dogs were brought in again. Soil samples were taken. Something was there, but still no body was recovered. Paul Flores had moved on with his life. But everywhere he went, suspicion followed. He was referred to as the last person seen with Kristin Smart, and in the eyes of the Smart family and much of the public, he was a free man who had gotten away with murder. For the Smarts, the passage of time was cruel. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries came and went. Kristin's younger siblings grew older, but she remained frozen in time at 19 years old. Denise Smart once described the pain as like an open wound that never heals. And yet, despite the years, the family refused to stop fighting. Their persistence kept Kristin's case alive in the media. It was this relentless pressure combined with the rising power of podcasts and renewed public attention that finally brought momentum back to the case. By 2019, investigators had new evidence. Searches around the Flores family home revealed biological material that could not be explained. Wiretaps and secret recordings hinted that Paul and his father might know exactly where Kristin's body had been hidden all these years. The pieces of the puzzle were finally aligning. But for more than 2 decades, the Smart family had lived with uncertainty. Every time a body was discovered in California, they held their breath. Every time new evidence surfaced, they hoped it would finally end their nightmare. For 25 years, Kristin Smart's story haunted San Luis Obispo. The case was whispered about in classrooms, retold in coffee shops, and debated on the internet. Everyone had a theory. Everyone thought they knew what happened. But only one person truly knew the truth: Paul Flores. In 2021, that truth was about to come crashing down. For 25 long years, Kristin Smart's disappearance was a case without an ending. Her parents, Stan and Denise, clung to hope, but lived with heartbreak. Paul Flores walked freely, his name whispered in every conversation, yet untouched by the law. But in 2019, a new energy surged into the investigation. Technology had advanced, public pressure was louder than ever, and law enforcement was determined to end this story once and for all. Investigators returned to the Flores family's home in Arroyo Grande, California. This was the place many had always suspected Kristin's body might have been hidden. Using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and forensic testing, they searched the property again. What they found didn't give them a body, but it gave them something almost as powerful: evidence of human remains once buried beneath the soil. Disturbed earth, traces of biological material, and the lingering scent of decomposition all pointed to a chilling possibility. Kristin had been there. It was enough to strengthen their case. Meanwhile, police employed a new tactic: wiretaps and secret recordings. Paul Flores was overheard making disturbing comments, hints that he knew far more about Kristin's disappearance than he had ever admitted. Investigators also recorded conversations with Paul's father, Ruben Flores. In one, Ruben was allegedly heard discussing Kristin's body, even suggesting it had been moved at some point. Piece by piece, the wall of silence around the Flores family began to crack. In April 2021, 25 years after Kristin vanished, authorities made their move. Paul Flores was arrested at his home and charged with the murder of Kristin Smart, his father. Ruben was arrested as an accessory accused of helping hide Kristin's body. For the Smart family, the moment was overwhelming. Denise Smart described it as surreal.
Yes.
After decades of fighting, the man they had always believed responsible was finally in handcuffs. But the fight wasn't over. The trial began in 2022, and it was one of the most closely watched court cases in California. Journalists, podcasters, and Kristin's family sat in the courtroom. Waiting to hear the truth that had been buried for so long, prosecutors laid out their case. Paul Flores had been the last person seen with Kristin Smart. Witnesses described her condition that night: vulnerable, intoxicated, and reliant on Paul for help. Cadaver dogs had alerted to his dorm room, his mattress, and his belongings. The Flores property showed evidence of a body once buried beneath the deck. And dozens of women came forward, testifying that Paul had a history of predatory behavior, drugging and assaulting women, stretching back decades. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of Paul Flores as a predator, who had taken advantage of Kristin, and she was helpless, murdered her, and then hidden her body with the help of his father. Paul's defense team argued there was no physical body, no DNA evidence, and no direct proof tying him to Kristin's death. They claimed the case was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. But for the jury, the pattern was undeniable. In October 2022, after weeks of testimony and nearly 3 decades of waiting, the verdict was read. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Kristin's family wept, holding each other tightly. After 25 years, they finally had the justice they had been denied for so long. Paul was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Ruben Flores, however, was acquitted of helping cover up the crime. The jury was not convinced there was enough evidence to convict him. It was a bitter pill for the Smart family, who believed he had played a role. But still, the central truth remained. Paul Flores, the man they had suspected all along, was finally behind bars. Kristin's remains have never been found. Her family continues to hope that someday, someone will reveal where she was laid to rest. For now, they live with the knowledge that justice, though delayed, was not denied. The Kristin Smart case is more than just a story of crime and punishment. It is a story of persistence, of a family who refused to be silent, a community that demanded answers, and investigators who never gave up. It also serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile justice can be and how much perseverance it sometimes takes to uncover the truth. Background music swells, mix of sorrow and triumph, slow piano with rising strings. Narrator's final words. Kristin Smart was only 19 years old when her life was stolen. For 25 years, her family lived in the shadow of her absence. And though they may never have the chance to bring her home, they have ensured her story will never be forgotten. Justice may come slowly. It may take decades. But as this case proves, even the darkest secrets cannot remain hidden forever. Fade out. Kristin's picture on screen with the words, "In memory of Kristin Denise Smart, 1977 to 1996,